Hey, podcast fam. This is Clark, the producer of the show. I just wanted to jump on real quick and touch on a couple things before we get into this episode. One, this episode is not suitable for children. So if kids are in the car, you got the little speaker on in the home and this show is playing right now, please turn this episode off. Join us for another one. Again, this episode, not suitable for the kids. Two, this episode does touch on subjects such as sexual violence and sexual assault. If this is something that is either triggering for you or you are a survivor, please feel free to not chime in this time. We respect your decision to not listen. We just want you to take care of yourself and know that you're loved. Please feel free to join us in on any episode or take a pause. You do you. You got this. That said, we love you guys. We believe in you. We're just grateful to have you here in our community. Thanks.
Welcome to Drinks with Defenders. I'm Addie B. Plate.
And I'm Kayla Murphy. We're two law school friends turned criminal defense attorneys turned podcast hosts.
We're here in this space because we now work in separate offices and miss collaborating with each other.
We've been talking about creating a podcast for years where we talk about the complexities of the criminal justice system, the aspects of it that we grapple with, and the importance of what we do.
At the end of a long work week, we want to sit down, have a drink with each other, and talk about the rabbit holes of criminal defense, just like we always have. So let's get into it. Cheers!
Yo.
What's up?
What up, fam? Missed you guys.
Missed you.
Missed you more.
How are you?
Oh, I'm so good. How are you?
Oh gosh, just dandy. Just dandy. Yeah, I've been like drinking a bit less these days. So
Me
I just
too.
finished my little hard strawberry lemonade and I'm like, oh wow, just one. And I kind of feel it a little bit.
She's
Look at
got a
that.
little bit of buzz on.
Like, does that mean I'm healthy? I think
Look
that
at
means I'm
you.
healthy.
I think so.
I've been drinking less
Yeah.
because I've come to find, well, there's lots of reasons why I just haven't been drinking very much, but I've found that alcohol is a big also trigger for my migraines. So like when I went back to law school, I was also pretty mindful of that because I was seeing a neurologist and we kind of did some like elimination of what might be triggering some of my migraines, and alcohol is a big trigger for that for me as well. And I get like weird, like ocular migraines where I'll like feel some tension in my eye and it won't go away for like several days. I'm sure screen time as an attorney doesn't help, but yeah, good for you.
That sucks.
Yeah.
Well, no, I was mostly joking that it meant I was healthy, that I was like a little bit buzzed after one drink. But no, that's amazing. Like, it's hard, man, just being a person and trying to get through the day sometimes.
Retweet.
Are you guys into fairs?
Yeah.
Of course.
You're both pretty festive people.
I'm very into fairs.
Aries, we love fairs.
I love a fair. I love introducing my non-American fiance to the concept of like American fairs, because it's like, what type of food do you want? Have you thought about that being fried? Okay, let's go try it. I like everything. I had the best corn dog at a fair, like not this past weekend. No, last weekend. I love a fair, man.
Oh my God. What a little culture shock for him. That's so cute. I can just imagine him like, what do you mean you fry cheese on a stick?
What do you mean you fry an Oreo? Yeah, 100%.
Yeah, let's not stop there. There's also fried Snickers.
Anything you can possibly think of.
Anything.
Fried.
Elephant ears.
All of it.
That's a big one in Indiana.
Oh, Indiana. Gosh, what was I going to say? I was helping out at a little booth for my At the fair, yes, for my little judicial candidate who I'm endorsing.
Oh, I love that for you.
Yes. Any Chelan County voters in the house, I'm endorsing Jay Stone for Chelan County District Court Judge. These district court judges have so much power, man. It's so important that they're fair and balanced. And Jay's been a prosecutor and a defense attorney. You and I both know most of these judges are just former prosecutors.
Yeah, I feel like my experience with judges who have had some criminal legal experience prior to taking the bench is usually that they've worked on like one side and then maybe they went into private practice or something. We do have some defense attorneys that were, that are on the bench, but I think that the more common route is like being a prosecutor and then wanting to become a judge. I don't
Total.
think very many defense attorneys want to be a judge after they've done this work. I don't know. I think it's just not
Yeah.
really what most of my friends who do defense work really aspire to. I've found that interesting. I think it would be really hard to learn what it's like to defend somebody from going to jail or prison and then be on the other side sentencing someone. I don't think I could do it, but
That's unfortunate though, because I feel like we need more people who have like that diverse perspective on the bench. You know what I mean?
absolutely,
But I feel
absolutely.
you. It's like hard to even be able to stomach the thought of doing some of the things that the law legally requires judges to do. You know what I mean? In terms of
Yeah,
sentencing stuff after, getting to know people.
right. I'm straight up advocating against that, you
Yeah.
know. So, but no, look at you doing your little civil service. Good for you.
Are you a
Good
Chelan
for
County
you.
voter? You look like a Chelan County voter. Let me tell you why you should vote for da-da-da. It's kind of fun. I kind of enjoy it, to be honest.
I'm so proud of you. That's amazing.
Thank you. How are you? How's work?
Work is good. I mean, I'm coming down in my last couple weeks of being, a true public defender as I know it. Still hoping to really take contract conflict cases. But it's really hard. Like it's really hard leaving. It's really hard thinking about that part of my identity and, you know, what's the word for it? Career, that part of my lore being behind me. I don't really know how to deal with that. So it's
I
been
mean, you're
hard
still going to have like a contract probably, right? Or you're going to like do conflict stuff.
to be determined.
Oh, okay.
So, um, yeah. So we'll see. But I'm good. Other than that, I was, just the chaos, just busy weeks. I mean, just very litigious weeks as well. It's hard when are planning on having multiple big hearings in a week, like a motion to suppress and a trial in the same week. And
Yeah, dude.
it's been a lot of just kind of really contested stuff like that lately, or so it's felt like that. So yeah, I'm just kind of trying to figure out how to grow, I guess.
So
It is
excited that you
officially,
get to like leave these things behind pretty soon though. And like it's not going to be your problem pretty soon.
I don't
I'm sure
know
it's going to
how,
weigh on you a little bit, but I hope that that feeling becomes liberating.
yeah, I just don't really know how to, I don't really know how to go about it or how to frame it so that it feels the way I need it to, but I'm working on it. Um, what was I going to say? Oh, it's officially like pumpkin season, which is officially like when I am so basic in that regard that I thrive in pumpkin season, not because of some of the reasons for it, but like Costco pumpkin pie is everything.
Oh my God, Costco.
Yeah, everything. And I'm more of a soup season girly than anything. I think soup should be a year-round thing, every type of soup. But I think it's more socially acceptable to just eat soup all fall. So all I want is to just be in comfy boots, warm sweaters, lots of jackets, and just eating soup. I thrive in the fall. It is my favorite season. The sports of the fall are always great too. So like Premier League soccer is back. It's football season. I thrive in the fall. So I'm very excited. And I love Halloween. Like I didn't love it as a kid and now I like it as an adult. I think it's fun. So I'm excited for that. I think it's probably now my favorite holiday. I think Halloween's probably my favorite. Just
Wow.
yeah, it's
I love
spooky.
that.
It's fun.
Have you guys been to Scarywood?
We're planning on going
Okay,
this year.
so
I'm
can
so
we fucking
excited.
all go together and let's see if there's like a
Yeah,
VIP option because those lines are ridiculous.
I'm down.
I want to go.
Oh my God, look who's here.
Hey,
You're so beautiful. Thank you
Hi,
so
I'm
much.
still trying to figure out. Hold on. Hang on just a second.
shut up. Your hair and outfit combination is so fucking cool.
He's iconic, dude.
I can't. Hey.
You guys hear me?
Yeah.
We sure can.
Awesome.
Thank you so much for joining us.
You are so welcome.
I just want to say I'm so thrilled with the people that we are getting to bring on our podcast lately. I just love some of the voices that we are getting to share this space with. And tonight is really no exception to that. I'm so excited to talk about kind of more of the fun, spicy side of our job. We haven't really gotten to dive into those waters yet. So I'm so excited.
Packing for my trip. So I'm like getting all my headphones and stuff together. So my phone's like, Bluetooth, you need the Bluetooth again? You want the Bluetooth again? I'm like, oh my God.
I
Where
hate
are you
that. I'm
going?
sorry.
I am going to Florida. I am going to be the keynote speaker at a sex and kink education conference for authors.
Shut up. That's so
Yeah.
cool.
That's
so that
so
we don't have another 50 Shades of Grey happen is kind of the...
Oh, hell yeah. Well, before we even dive into it, why don't you just like introduce yourself and tell our listeners where they can follow you?
Yeah, absolutely. My name is Moxie Rose. I call myself a spicy educator, usually because I'm educating on platforms that I can't usually say what I actually do, but I am a sex and kink educator. I have been doing this for about 10 years as an educator. I have been a practitioner in my personal life for about 20 years. I do in-house education for Mister Pierre Fashion. So between my TikTok account and my Instagram account are usually where I can be found. Both of them are just Moxie Rose dances. I also am a columnist for the Comet magazine, where I write a monthly sex and kink education column.
Oh, cool.
That is so cool.
Oh my God. Well, we're so excited to have you here. I have so many things I want to pick your brain about, but I'll try to kind of keep it in the legal realm.
That is okay.
This
This is a totally new one to me.
I am so excited. I feel like I was telling Kayla that just the intersection of our work is kind of sometimes the fun side of, I think, criminal defense is we get to be creative. Kayla and I have talked about that. And I think really understanding other just things in life that cross with the criminal legal system is, I think, some of the liberty that criminal defense has. Like we get to understand science and like pharmacology, and we kind of have to dabble a little bit in all these different arenas to do our job.
Yeah.
And obviously sex is a big part of criminal defense. Like it can become a part of your job very quickly, and you have to understand what you're looking at, right? And so I'm just so excited because Kayla, you picked such an awesome topic and guest. Like you continue to just add value to Drinks with Defenders. So shout out to my co-host. She killed it again.
So today, we're diving into the world of kink and BDSM and the way that these alternative sexual lifestyles and activities make their way into the courtroom and like how they're treated in the courtroom, right? Here to share her expert opinion is Moxie Rose. So let's just start at the beginning. Like, what is a kink?
A kink is a big umbrella. A lot of times kink and fetish get used interchangeably. They are actually different. A kink is a broad umbrella term that is used to refer to anything that falls outside of what is considered the mainstream normal sexual activity, which is very subjective because normal is going to be heavily influenced, not just in people, but in your region that you are in, the countries that you are in. So it just refers to anything that falls outside of what would be considered the mainstream.
What about BDSM? What is that?
BDSM falls under kink. So BDSM is just another acronym for multiple different things that can fall under kink. So you can do the bondage without doing the discipline, the sadomasochism, the masochism. Like you don't have to do any of the submission, anything like that. You can do the submission without the masochism, without the. So BDSM is kind of big umbrella term, but each individual piece of that or BDSM altogether fits underneath the kink umbrella.
Right on. Okay. So what would you say? I mean, are there any like defining principles within
Consent.
the communities? Okay.
Consent reigns supreme because everything that is done, whether it is a kink or a fetish, everything that is done is we're already outside of what people view as like the mainstream, where the conversation, the way that most people see it going in their head is something to the effect of, hey, do you want to do this? Yeah, sure. And that's kind of the end of it. But then you add a lot of other dynamics into this, such as impact play, where you are literally hitting your partner with certain things. And how do you reconcile that between like, you're told not to hit people, that's not okay, but yet this is a consensual act and one that both parties are actually getting something out of. So the way that you always go about making sure that everything that is done, no matter what it is through consent, is through having the most detailed, laid out, well thought out conversation about consent. A lot of times you will even see people use like almost a document where they just are very clearly outlining what they like, what their boundaries are, any potential triggers they may have, what their partner has, things like that, so that everybody has an idea that when they say like, yeah, I like impact, that the other person doesn't haul off and just use whatever they want. They can say, but only specifically for these things and not with this or things like that. So consent is the very first conversation. There's acronyms in this world that have changed over time, get used a lot. Safe, sane, and consensual is one of them that is kind of in the years has fallen out of favor for other ones. FRIES is another big one, FRIES, and it refers to how you should view your consent and your partner's consent, that your consent should be freely given, reversible, informed, FRIEI, enthusiastic, specific. I had to figure out how to spell fries there for a second. Oh, reversible. That was the R, reversible. So freely given, reversible, informed, enthusiastic, specific.
Wow.
Can I unpack a few things and just add some commentary? So I was trying to do some homework before we had you on the podcast. Again, thank you so much for being here. And the first three things that you mentioned, I'm going to do a plug for a law review article, which I have yet to do on the podcast, but I was doing some reading and I found a very interesting law review article from Arizona's Law Review. And the author is Micah Galilee Belfer. And the article is called BDSM, Kink, and Consent: What the Law Can Learn from Consent-Driven Communities. And I found it to be very interesting. And it talks about how the law, because I think, Kayla, what we're probably going to kind of get into the weeds with is this concept of consent, because that's where it really becomes kind of a mess in the courtroom, I think, certainly from the defense perspective. And I found the article to be really, really interesting. It did some studies from some states, but my reading of it really touched on, I think, the definition that you just gave of consent and kind of the spirit behind it in BDSM communities or in kink communities, about how it's kind of a more comprehensive scope of consent that I think the law kind of doesn't have in the same way, because where consent in certain contexts isn't a defense to things like regular battery or things like that. And there's some interesting case law that I'm sure we'll probably talk about. But I just wanted at the outset to put a plug in for it, because I found this article to be really, I think, what we're going to talk about today, which is just that the communities that are more like the activity between consenting adults, the law, I think, is kind of lacking, but there are, legal, sometimes contracts in BDSM communities or kink communities that I think are very interesting and statutorily available for the law. And so I just wanted to put a plug out there. It was the first time where I was like, "Ooh, I actually like that law review article. It wasn't poorly written, and I thought it to be very interesting." So, I congrats to the writer. I liked your stuff. I don't think that he'll ever listen to our podcast, assuming that that's his pronoun. But the author, I really liked it, and not something that I would think we would see in Oregon's law review. So, congratulations, Arizona, on having such a forward piece in your law review. But very interesting article. And I was trying to get to the sentence that I liked where it said,
What's the name
this
of it?
part, the title says it's BDSM, kink, and consent, what the law can learn from consent driven communities. And you can find it on the internet, you can just Google it. But there was a paragraph that said following. Second, the current legal practice of categorically framing BDSM activities as both privately and publicly harmful precludes the use of consent as an affirmative defense, even when such a defense is statutorily available. The destigmatization of BDSM is critical for preventing actual abuse. And then it continues on, but and then it just concludes that paragraph with further such a framing better reflects the reality that adults engaged in consensual BDSM do so knowingly and rationally. So I found it very interesting and kind of touched on a lot of the points that I wanted to drive home. So I just wanted to plug it at the outset. Great read. But kind of going back into it, in terms of consent, Kayla, do you have any thoughts you wanted to ask in terms of follow up with that? Because I think she mentioned enthusiastically, and it made me think of Leininger, Professor Leininger in law school, when he was talking about how different states have different, definitions of consent too. I think DC has a pretty comprehensive consent statute or consent definition, but some states not so much. Consent isn't something that's really fleshed out well in the law. But he always said that anything other than a hell yes should be considered a hell no. And I found
Yeah,
that to be comprehensive of this understanding of like enthusiastically.
for sure. It's really interesting how different states have different definitions of consent. And like under their law, there are things which, you can consent to in some states and in other states you
Yeah.
can't, right? It's interesting. Like, I guess one question I had for you, Miss Moxie Rose, is there like any kind of consensus as to like if there are things that you just straight up like can't or shouldn't ask people to consent to within the kink
Ooh.
community, like irregardless of what the law has to say about it?
So it depends on who you're talking to and what this is kind of like when I get asked about contracts, where like my partner wants me to sign a contract and then I have them tell me like describe the contract, and what they actually name is not a contract, not meant to be enforced. It's basically just an outline of everybody's boundaries, but they lack a term for it, so they use the term contract. But like by no means are you going to be able to like hold that up in court and be like they said yes. That's not how that works. So it's not a contract. So it depends on what they are trying to describe. So a lot of people, the first thing that their mind goes to when they ask that question, and I will say that most of the time I get that question, it's not asked in good faith like it's being right now. It's asked in bad faith. And so
Yeah.
usually the question that's in their head that they're waiting to follow up with is, well, if you are 25 and your partner is 17, 16, they're the legal age. They can consent. Yeah, sure, by a legal definition, you may be able to actually say that. However, in real practice, in the community that very much always is fighting a stigma, you will not often find that at all, because in their head, you are still a child. You can't consent. And I think there's not really a general rule to it, but the general understanding amongst the community is that you should have a fair amount of practice being able to advocate for yourself in any regard before you start dabbling in more aggressive forms of kink and BDSM and things like that. So the people that are younger and just exploring sexual activity and kind of, well, my boyfriend's a few years older than me, has some experience, and he wants to, string me up on a St. Andrew's cross. Absolutely not. Like, but also the hard part of that is they are a completely consenting party. Like outside of the law and this hit in a courtroom, you're talking to somebody that is quite literally looking at you going, I want to do this. You're very clearly hearing this enthusiastic consent. And you know that they're going to go do stuff anyway. So is it more important to do risk mitigation or just tell them, no, don't do it, knowing that they're going to? So consent is so heavy in the conversation around kink that you will not really ever find things that people will like, you can't do that. You can't ask people to do that regardless of the consent, because where you start to get to an absolute no, there are people that can't consent anyway. This is like talking about kids. Kids can't consent. So no, they're never going to come up in that conversation because you can't consent. People think of like, well, what about animals? It's like, oh my God, we're literally grasping at straws in the hopes of demonizing something. And that's never how it actually goes down. So it really depends on the person. Like you will have people that the idea of doing any sort of CNC, consensual non-consent play, is triggering and awful for them. You probably are not going to find them doing that stuff. You're probably not going to find them consenting to do that play. But it doesn't mean that the person that was asking them can't also find somebody in their life that you both can consent to. So as long as both parties can legally consent and are able to consent and want to consent, there's not really anything that is not done, that is not ever heard of, things like that.
My question, and Kayla, kind of building off of you, are there things in the community that are absolute no-nos in terms of just, because, you just mentioned a question that I think everything that we're trying to ask is 100% in good faith. But I think it is a very stigmatized community. So in terms of hard rules, are there any?
Violating consent and boundaries. So whether that is like outright the way that we all see it in our head, like somebody grabbing you without consent, like physically touching you without consent, it can also be down to the consent within a dynamic that we have things that are called honorifics. They are names that are given to different partners in dynamics. You do not have to have them or use them. But some people in different like actual dynamics versus just a relationship, they will sometimes use honorifics. And so this is like where you hear people that kind of self-identify themselves as a dominant, that they will refer to themselves as like a daddy. Like daddy is an honorific. You also have master, you have sir, you have a lot of them. You have mistress. There is a ton of them for anybody. But using honorifics, if you have not been given consent to use that honorific, is a huge no-no. It's the same as somebody, it's not illegal. And it's not like you've done something, but it has the same feel to it in the community as somebody like walking up to a woman they don't know and going, "What's up, sweet cheeks?" You didn't actually do anything wrong, but everybody around you just got the ick because of it. So using honorifics is kind of when it's not been given consent to, and you haven't been, given that consent, you haven't given that consent yourself. That's a big no-no. Other than that, it's assuming boundaries. It really is all rooted in consent. It's assuming boundaries and overstepping them. It's assuming consent when there wasn't any. So that everything that is like a hard no in this world has to do with consent. There are hard no's, but those have to do with like the couple. So the community at large, the big no is do not violate somebody's consent. Do not violate somebody's boundaries. A hard no for me personally, I don't like to be hit in the face. Like you go down to, but I like to do impact play. I just don't like the head or the face. So for me, that's a hard no, but it's not a hard no that applies to the community at large.
Okay. So it sounds like, obviously you're very educated about this. And I guess just from speaking with you, my impression is like other people within the community, probably try to educate themselves about these things and, abide by these principles and consent and all of that.
Yeah.
It seems like certain sexual, I guess what I want to know is like, I know you have to watch a lot of porn as part of your job. Do you see any porn, like trends in porn that you ever kind of like uh, are concerned about people maybe trying to like imitate and not doing it in a safe way?
All of it. Only because if I knew who the audience was, I could give you a better idea of whether or not I'm concerned for that audience. But it's also kind of like, did anybody ever ask anybody if watching the Fast and Furious movies made everybody nervous to let kids drive? Probably not, but there was a lot shown in that movie that's not accurate, but it doesn't stop people from trying to portray it. So sometimes there are people that are smart enough to recognize that what they are watching, they have missed the whole conversation about boundaries and consent leading up to that. Because it's not sexy to watch. Like when you sit down to watch porn, you're not looking for the conversation of, okay, so here are my hard boundaries. These are my soft boundaries. What are yours? This is my trigger. What is yours? Here's what to do. Like everybody would be fast forwarding that. You get to the part where there's the movie, just like in any other movie that has any sort of sex scene in it. You already knew that those actors were consenting to portray this because you understood that it was a movie. And there seems to be a disconnect that people accept a certain amount of that they accept a certain amount of that in movies. They understand this is movie magic. I'm missing stuff. I'm missing part of this conversation. But in porn, they don't necessarily stop to think of that. So there are certain acts that, like CNC, anything that falls under CNC, that there is this, I know that they have consented, that this is amateur. These are people that literally set up a camera in their bedroom and did what they were already doing. Just now it's on display for the world. So this is part of why I am a huge supporter in the amateur angle of this. I don't like the big box, like movie versions of this. I think porn can be predatory. I think the porn industry can be predatory, not because it is porn, but because it is an industry. And so if you have, there's a website that's like, there's many like them, but one of them that I love is called Make Love Not Porn. And it's just couples. It's just couples or people that have like other partners that they play with. And this is just home video stuff. All the production is in their hands. The money goes right to them. This is kind of like OnlyFans, but like on a more couple kind of angle. So you've taken out this middleman. And so there's a more realistic idea because you see people having conversations midway through this that you'll hear them say, "Are you okay? Is this okay?" Or that, you'll hear those conversations, whereas they are cut out of most of these like bigger ones. So you always hope that people recognize that everything you're seeing, that was already consented to. The reason that it's happening is because it was consented to. So like slapping her across the face in this movie, she consented to that. This was already pre-negotiated. They probably already found thresholds and everything off camera. Meanwhile, you have somebody that thinks that was super. I enjoyed watching that. That was super hot for me to watch. So it's got to be hot in general. And so they just haul off and end up hitting somebody. And there's also then the understanding that, well, you are into kink. You're obviously into this. And that is the difference between people that actually practice in this world and people that do not, is that they took one small piece of consent that wasn't even theirs to be given and applied it to whatever they wanted to. And that's not actually what consent is. So that stuff makes me nervous. But it made me nervous with 50 Shades of Grey, too. 50 Shades of Grey did more damage to kink and BDSM than porn has ever done.
Question. Can you explain what CNC is?
CNC is another like big umbrella term, kind of like kink is, that refers to, stands for consensual non-consent. So it's a huge umbrella, like one that we'd be here all day if we went through everything that fits under there. However, the one that usually jumps to people's minds and why the term CNC usually brings about a very negative knee-jerk reaction is things like rape play, which I don't even use the term rape play because to me, I understand what is happening here. I understand what I'm looking at. By its very definition, rape implies a lack of consent. And so for me, I kind of just, I don't like using that term. But if somebody asked me about it and said, my partner and I are interested in doing CNC, specifically rape play, I I hear
You
you.
understand?
I
Yeah.
hear what you're asking. Right. So it's in my personal life. I don't like using that term, but it has to do with my own, own assault and my own triggers around it. So it's rape play is in there with it. It's anything that if the consent were not present, it would be assault. So,
Got it.
and it's, so you could kind of say that about anything. You could say that about sex, but my way of saying it is there is no such thing as non-consensual sex. There's rape. Sex by its definition implies that you were given that consent. So if there isn't consent, it's rape. So there is no non-consensual sex. There's rape or there's sex. So you can't apply that to anything, but it's the things like impact play can fall under it, because if you gave somebody consent to use a flogger or a paddle on you, you gave that consent. If your partner just decided to take a paddle to you, that is battery. It's abuse. The defining difference was the consent. If you gave consent to do something like act out an assault scene, as graphic as that may be, as much as you are acting out this role, it is still an act. You have given your consent and you are playing a role. If the consent were not there and it was proceeding, now it is real assault. So it's anything that falls under that umbrella that if that was not clear, it completely changes its meaning.
The thing that is so hard, and Kayla, I want you to ask about 50 Shades of Grey if you were kind of going to go that direction. But something that I've been thinking about is that from my perspective, I would say most like Americans are kind of in this category of like, you know, sexually experimental, but very much in a kind of nuanced and quieted way. And so a lot of people's education about sex comes through kind of weird avenues. And so in terms of
Like porn, usually,
like
right? Just
porn
porn. You can't think of any
or
other
what
place.
they learn in school or college or whatever it may be. And so I mean, you kind of mentioned it. I think you did like a plug on one of your social medias about coming on the podcast. The average juror or just average client, and maybe the average like alleged victim in a case, is typically not someone who is, you know, within the community, perhaps. And so you're dealing with people, and sometimes, like from my end of my perspective, this like violence and sex thing usually comes to play with like things like choking or attempted strangulation as it's charged in the criminal legal world. And then it's very interesting because some people do enjoy being grabbed while they're having sex. And so you're doing this dance, and Kayla, I'm sure you've had to do it with your clients where if you're talking about their relationship with their partner, or if it's somebody where you have conversations of, oh yeah, but that's just a normal part of our sex life. Um, but they might not be, you know, people who have had those conversations in the same way that you were just talking about. And that's where it gets very messy.
Mhm.
And so in terms of, I would like to give you that to think about too, because I think that something that is very difficult from the defense perspective is that when you're talking to your client and you're representing your client, they are the experts on their own life, right? And so we have to talk to our clients, and if they're explaining their dynamic with another person, you learn a lot about the other person and sometimes not from the other person's perspective
Mhm.
because you're learning about it from your client. And then conveying that to, say you go to trial, conveying that to a jury. And then there's rules of evidence that certainly preclude certain information from coming in. I mean, what are your thoughts with that? Because if you're having to take a person that's like being charged with something,
Mhm.
and the defense may be, well, that's just how their sex life is. As somebody who's in that community, what's your perspective on that?
I feel like this is where I get a real passion for the education around this, that whether or not you are interested in practicing kink or BDSM, and most people, I would say, statistically, far more people than are prepared to admit it, practice kink in their life, whether they are aware of it or not. There's people that will very
Absolutely.
much like they talk down, they look down, So you've never spanked your partner on the butt, like swatted him on the butt, like in the middle of like a feverish moment. They're like, well, yeah. I'm like, define the difference between impact with a paddle and that. If you cannot, you have to accept that both of those were impact and that you may be flirting with a line that you did not think so. So whether or not you are interested in being a practitioner in your personal life, I think people owe it to themselves to at least either familiarize yourself enough with it or admit that you don't know that about it and excuse yourself from being a juror in this, because you now hold somebody's potential life in your hands, all based around your ignorance, your self-admitted ignorance. And you could just excuse that. It's kind of like what happened with Jaws. Nobody cared about the science of sharks until everybody was afraid of getting eaten at the beach because of this thing that was completely fictional. And even Peter Benchley, who wrote the book, came out swinging in defense of sharks and was like, if I knew that this was going to happen, I never would have written that. Put his life into preserving these animals. And it was all because of he saw that what his book did changed the course of people's mind. People say, and then there was an entire movement to, okay, hold on, stop. We have this wrong. How do we make it right? And the way that you made it right was by educating people about sharks, was by educating people about these are not man eaters. This is not what it's like. Here's what it really is like. And it took people back down from the edge, that it was no longer this boogeyman waiting in the water. You kind of understood this is not real. This was Hollywood. And we have yet to do that with kink and BDSM. The closest we got was 50 Shades, who couldn't have gotten it more wrong if they tried. And so then we're up against, not only do people not want to listen to us because we're the degenerates, we're the outset, we're the others, we've been othered, but we're the ones that actually have this right and are the experts on the subject. Meanwhile, you have somebody that took Twilight fan fiction and turned it into a very dangerous representation of kink and kink relationships. And that took off like wildfire. And it was spreading with its misinformation faster than we could educate. And media is, by and large, the most efficient way to influence people. And so
Yes.
If you thought it was bad with the book, then came the movie. And then came the 2 other books, and then came the 2 other movies. And you were hearing people describe their ideas of kink and kink relationships. And you heard it like word for word coming out of this book. And you're just sitting there going, oh my God, this is like people saying, I've got a little bit of a medical background. It's like, oh, sweet. What'd you study? I've watched all the seasons of Grey's Anatomy. It's like,
Yeah.
did you hear yourself?
I love that.
I watched Law and Order. I know about the courtroom. Yeah, 100%.
Yeah. It gets difficult because you not only have to separate fantasy of a book or a movie from real life, but also remind people that just because it got popular doesn't mean that she had any idea what she was writing about. Just because it got popular, this is like, what do you call a doctor that graduates at the bottom of their class? Doctor. Doesn't mean they're good. And so it is really difficult because the law does not develop as fast as the world around it. And the general world is developing faster than we are able to keep up and educate with people, because they still look down on this community and kind of ostracizing, kind of they speak to you very patronizing about it. And makes it very difficult to educate on this. But if you had a jury box that was filled predominantly with people that at least had a very basic understanding of kink and consent and what consent looks like in kink world, you have a jury that is more likely to see straight through somebody trying to sell somebody a bill of goods because they think that they can get away with it. I don't know if that makes your guys' jobs harder or easier as defenders, but that's the reality of it. Is it gets harder to fool people who are educated, period.
Amen. Preach, sister. I'm so curious as to when that book came out because I read this article. Let's see, it was called Getting Away with Murder, a review of the rough sex defense by Hannah Bowes and Jonathan Hearing. And basically, they were saying that this defense was like relatively rare until, let's see, what was it? Until 2010, when it increased, let's see, they said at least 90%.
I would say, if I had to guess, I would say that the 50 Shades book probably came out sometime around 2007 or 8. I don't actually know off the top of my head, but if I had to guess and think back to like when I started like remembering seeing that, somebody else might have to look. I have no idea.
Addie looks like she's on it.
I'm looking.
I was going to say.
I'm looking. I think that the first one came out in 2011.
Was that the book or the movie?
I think the book. I could be wrong. Kind of pivoting, but something that I was thinking about too, because I was thinking about just the law around BDSM is really interesting too. And Kayla, we were talking about, I think kind of tangentially on the podcast before about kind of the dangerous, movement of courts, primarily with cases that had to do with like rights to privacy. We were talking about abortion cases previously. And I found something very interesting about how this court, it was a federal district court of East Virginia back in 2016, ruled that while the Supreme Court decided that states cannot pass laws prohibiting sodomy between consenting adults, Americans have no constitutional right to BDSM. And so then I was looking at that case, and that case is called Doe versus George Mason University et al. And so it seems like a bunch of universities were involved. But something that was also interesting from that case, the court apparently also suggested that public universities could consider BDSM to be sexual misconduct. It's a very interesting kind of movement that we have. I had said as a law student when we were kind of gearing up for what the next decisions were going to look like based upon the appointments of judges around the country, that we needed to keep an eye on cases that were going to have Lawrence v. Texas challenges, and I know Obergefell issues. And I think that continues to be true. But in terms of the community that we're talking about today, there's cases that are around the country that are addressing other aspects of it. And I found that to be interesting. And so I wanted to flag that as well. I have like a weird obsession with weird laws in different states. Like that's something I'm just interested in. Like anytime I find a weird law in states, I find it very interesting. But I found that New York has a state law that is against possessing a pair of handcuffs unless you are a law enforcement officer, a private investigator, or a security guard. And the potential penalties for it are a fine of up to $200 and or 10 days in jail. And in Florida, it is a felony to carry a concealed handcuff key. I don't really know what makes something a concealed handcuff keys. And I looked at the New York statute, and if they are handcuffs where you can't actually restrain somebody, I think it's legal. But if it's something that you could actually lock somebody in and not get out of, it's illegal, apparently. And I was
Which is interesting because handcuffs are very rarely handcuffs are very rarely used in BDSM because it's
right.
It's uncomfortable. Like it's not even for any, like, we don't use that because we're smarter than that. They're just freaking uncomfortable. They're metal. You've got rope. You've got, like big, thick, like those cuffs. This is a bracelet that turns into handcuffs. And so
Whoa.
I have them on one thing. So and this is made of leather. Yeah. So this is when I introduce my job, and we say that I usually have my bracelet on right here. So we're purveyors of fine leather goods, perfect for daytime or playtime. So it's interesting that they try to write that because it ignores how many other things can bind
used.
You. Yeah. And also, you could get into the weird law where it's, you're going to come into my bedroom and rifle through my stuff to see if I have a pair of handcuffs. There are states, I think it's Texas. Maybe that's just because this sounds like it's Texas. You are not allowed to own more than 2 prophylactics, as they call them, or marital aids, as they call them. So you can't have more than 2 dildos.
I think that is sexist. I feel like I've heard this before.
And like, how exactly, like when they got written, like what was the thought process of how that was going to be enforced? Like, the laws. Also, the interesting part about the laws, as I have so far heard them, and that's my law degrees in the mail. Like, just I don't know the law.
You can have mine. I'll just hand it to
you. The interesting part about the way that they are worded is they center sex. Sex and kink do not have to go together. Sex and BDSM do not have to go together.
Right.
So it's interesting that the law very much is very wordy around the sexualized part of that, when you have a very large part of the community that utilize kink and BDSM and fetishes, or kink and BDSM as like a non-sexual thing. This is where like the fetish and the kink thing getting used interchangeably becomes an issue, because fetishes are specifically sexual, because what it refers to is something that must be present in order for you to feel aroused or reach climax. It has to be present in person or in like you have to be thinking about it, but it's non-negotiable. You won't be able to get aroused without it. And kink is not like that. Kink is like adding fun stuff to what was already happening. And so you can use aspects of kink like impact without having it be sexual in nature. Whereas fetishes are literally saying, this is sexual in nature. You have to have these in order to get off or feel aroused. So that's, again, part of the ongoing, making sure that people have that general understanding of the most basic things of that kink and fetish are not the same, and kink doesn't have to be sexual. It's an interesting topic, and the kink does not have to be sexual is a huge one to unpack, because lots of people don't really understand that one. But then you talk about let me pose you this. Let me say that you're talking to somebody who knows you very well, knows every intimate part of your life, detail by detail. You feel very comfortable sharing with them. You regularly divulge your traumas, your feelings, your everything to them. Does it sound like I'm talking about somebody's partner? What if I was talking about somebody's therapist?
Right. The thing that's so interesting to me, and again, this is going to be coming from a very uneducated, I think, place, is that, well, I think my inquiry is kind of two-part. First and foremost, you were talking about people who are not experienced in this world.
Yeah.
And I've always found that makes so much sense. But in terms of where people would get educated, that always feels like the wrong question to ask, right? I feel like that's always kind of oh, okay, don't want to out communities of that in that way whatsoever. But for people who are say interested in something specifically, certainly there's communities that then are access points for them. But I don't even know where people would start with that. And then two, kind of turning back to the question or the point that you made about it making our jobs harder, I think it would be super interesting for a defense attorney where there is an aspect of maybe kink present, and that being kind of something that they're touching on with a sex case, potentially consulting with, someone like you about jury questions or things like that.
Totally. You could be like an expert witness.
Yeah. Or just things that you would want to do screening for with I would want to ask you questions to kind of build my voir dire ideas.
That's an excellent idea and an excellent point, because the downside is that if you got creative as a defender and decided to just, for better, for worse, say, we're going to use this angle that this was all consensual part of this consenting act that you guys do together, and that they feel like they are now saying that something happened that didn't, but they actually consented to it. And all that, if we decided to take that angle, whether or not it was true in this case, you have now given permission. You've greenlit every predator to say, hey, by the way, if you want to get rid of it, just say that you're part of the kink community. And now we are up against another angle of this, why world is stigmatized, people forgetting that this world's existed as long as sex has existed. As long as there have been people having sex, there have been people getting creative with their ways of having it. And
100%.
so, yeah, so I think being very like aware of the questions, I also think it makes you better defenders, because if your client says, well, and you know better, you can say, we can't say that. We can't use that. But what we can do is this. So it helps you actually be able to defend your client, do your job without setting a precedent that is going to follow the kink community around for another, 100 years. So it's that part. I think it would be a really good idea if more people did that, if more people consulted on it. As far as where people go to get education, the nice part is that we now live in a world where education is at your fingertips at all times. It can be daunting to decipher what is good education and what is not, but that doesn't really ever stop people in general. Nobody I'm going to just use politics because we're in the middle of an election season. So people talking about whose policies are what and what effects it might have and what this person's, budget representations would do to this and this and then just there's 1,000 conversations to have. And nobody ever stops and goes, well, you don't know who you can trust on the internet with this stuff. So just don't look it up at all. You would still tell people, no, go look it up. You just have to try to sift through some of this stuff. This one, people just kind of sweep it to don't trust the internet. And it's why not? We trust the internet with everything else. You may as well just learn how to use the internet correctly. So if you find multiple people that are educators, because that's the difference, is that you will see people saying, I am a practitioner, I do kink, versus I am a kink educator. And the people that describe themselves as educators, find multiple people that all say that they're educators and look for the common threads in what they are saying. If they all are educators and they all actually do that, you will have very big threads running through each of what they said. There will not be if it depends on who you ask. No, the definition of consent is not going to change in this world depending on who you ask. The conversation around how to lay out that consent for, a bigger act. Some people may have better ways of doing that or more thought out ways of doing it or more practice doing it, but you're never going to find anybody that just doesn't hold consent at the top of that. So it depends on who the person is, because the other hard part of this is I do sex education as well. I'm a certified sex educator. There are parameters to that you have to meet in order to become a certified sex educator, because there are certain things anatomically that we've all agreed on that's
you kind of need to know.
Yeah. We're still also figuring that out, but because, pleasure-based sex is not taught either. You're taught where everything is, but you're not really taught anything else. Everybody thinks that they know something when they just say, oh, yeah, I know where the G-spot is. I know where the clit is. Did you know that they're the same piece of anatomy? They're not two different things. Yeah, exactly. So that kind of stuff. With kink, it's anecdotal. There is no school that you go to learn this. You learn it after practice. And so it's a lot of people kind of sometimes you can figure it out on your own if you have two people standing next to you. And one says, I'm an educator. I have been a kink practitioner for 20 years, and I have been an educator in this world for 10 years. And you have somebody else that goes, I am new to educating, but I've been a practitioner for 5 years. Great. I mean, they were fully honest they've got 5 years. They're very new to teaching, so at least they were honest about that. But if you were to say which one of them is going to be the better educator, probably the one with more years under their belt. So you can kind of start to sift through it a little on that. This is why I also fight the censorship around talking on TikTok, talking on Facebook, on Instagram, that I need to be able to reach people, because you're not going to always find people being able to get this kind of education. Even basic comprehensive sex education, people are forbade from getting, or they live in a state that makes it impossible. My home state is Florida. Like we're writing the book on how to screw this one up. So I think that the ongoing dedication to the education is good, because the more it becomes a popular thing, the more you have people comfortable talking about it, the more you have people comfortable listening to it, the more it is taking this one little thing and making it accessible to everybody. There's my mom, oddly enough, in the middle of this kink education. I'm going to reference my mother, who has a degree in marketing, specifically around an area of marketing called diffusion of innovation, and it is how things spread like a rumor or a virus, and it is who you want to target if you want to get your information out there. And so the internet is perfect for this. And so the more education that is out there on the internet, the more you begin to get familiar with it, so that when you come across something that doesn't sound quite right, that you either can back up and go ask another educator who can say, actually, yes, this is a thing. Let me explain this. Or they can say, no, it's not. Or you begin to get so much education under your belt, you go, this isn't right. My favorite saying is, if you look at the world through rose-colored glasses, all red flags just look like flags. And so if you are educated on enough of this, you can kind of start to combat that. So it's the people that you're actively seeking this information. Maybe it's helping by actively voting for people that are not going to suppress this information, that take the angle of, look, if it's not for you, it's not for you. However, this information needs to be accessible to people, because it's going to help other people. It's going to keep people from getting hurt.
I appreciate that. And I think that this is something that's so concerning from the defense perspective too, is that you will have clients who, I think because of the society and the culture that we live in, we don't have access to information about sex. So of course they go online and maybe they begin watching pornography or something like that. And that then becomes somewhat of a relevant fact if they get a case. And so it'll be like in their incident report that there's allegations of this person watching pornography. And then, Kayla, I think that turns into a 404B issue that you might have to fight about, in terms of like, is this person's exposure to internet sex and whatever context of that relevant to this other sexual act that they're accused of doing? And it's sad that becomes an issue as well. I can kind of understand some of the ties to it, but I think more often than not, a lot of people go on the internet for information about
sorry,
sex.
real quick, 404B,
Yeah.
What is that? Is that relevance? I don't even remember.
It's prior bad acts.
Oh shit. Okay.
It's prior bad acts. So, okay, we'll dive into this. So if the prosecution wants to introduce a prior bad act of a defendant that is, they're going to say is it has to pass the relevancy rule as well, but it has to be for some intended purpose, like motive, opportunity, intent, absence of mistake, things like that. So usually before trial, if the case goes to trial, the defense will the state has to provide notice of their intent to introduce 404B evidence. In this case, the example I'm using is like prior watching pornography. So they would have to provide notice of their intent to introduce that if they want to introduce that at trial. And
why would watching pornography right off the bat be considered a prior bad act?
Good question.
Great question. And I think that that's something that I agree. I don't think watching pornography in of itself is a bad act.
Yeah.
But they might use it to introduce, this person's like sexual interest.
Yeah, or say it goes to like their motive, or there's some other exception to bring it in.
Very much has the same feel as when we started blaming Columbine on Marilyn Manson.
It's totally. And so I'm just kind of connecting of how this can kind of tend to work out. And so, in my exposure with sex cases, I've done some juvenile sex cases, particularly with young people, we don't have a great sex education system in schools. We just don't. And a lot of young people go to the internet to learn that information. Then it becomes something that might be used against them in a court of law. And that's very interesting too. And, usually isn't super relevant to maybe what's actually being litigated. Sometimes it might be, or the state is going to argue that it might be. It's really I always feel like with sex stuff from the defense perspective, it's always kind of like, damn if you do, damn if you don't.
Yeah.
And it's very, yeah, I don't know, Kayla, what your take is on that, but I feel like, if people are having consensual sex and then that's your defense at trial, or if people are interested in something, it's, and then if you were going to put that at trial, just the nature of the topic itself might be offensive to jurors because that's again the society and the culture that we live in. And you said something earlier, and I kind of wanted to lighten the mood a little bit. And but have any of you ever heard of the show Sex Sent Me to the ER? Yes. Okay.
I
Have
haven't
you ever
watched
heard of
it.
this show?
I don't know when it says that I'm the one person like nodding to this.
Are you a fan? Would you recommend?
I am fascinated by it. I don't know if fan would be, but it's like watching a train wreck because there's certain things that you watch and you can already see it coming before we've gotten there. Like everybody else is like one step behind me on it because I'm like, oh no. Oh
That's
no.
a bad idea.
Oh, no. Yeah. And they're like, why? What's happening? I'm like, oh no. Oh no. Yeah.
It is amazing. Would recommend, just like a plug for a show. It's like funny. And sometimes they have like medical staff that's like giving their impression on why this is a bad idea. When you were explaining about, people not really being educated and then it being a bad choice, it immediately made me think of that show where it's like, oh, people are experimenting with sex and they haven't really known how to do it. And then there's an entire show about that. So would recommend, Kayla. Today I'm going to give you the trash TV recommendation.
Only in America where we have like no sex education can we have a fucking show like this. And it's like our society. Of course, we love that shit. But it's so weird because like we have such puritanical roots and our society is so fucking weird about sex, which is why I think it's so important that we have these conversations and we normalize this stuff and we think critically about it. So with that being said, Moxie Rose.
Sells.
Yes,
Yeah.
hell yeah.
Yeah.
We've taken so much of your time. We'll let you go.
That's okay. I love being here. Actually, one of the things that I did want to just make mention of because the education thing came up, this is also part of why I think that it is important to have pleasure-based sex education available. And everybody's reaction is very like knee-jerk to that, especially because when this conversation around sex education comes up, we are often referring to like middle school and high schoolers, sometimes even elementary school. And like, I mean, I do sex education with my daughter. My daughter is 8 years old. The basis of her sex education is what consent looks like, which for her has nothing to do with sexual activity. It has everything to do with body autonomy. So like her doctor is not allowed to touch her unless she gives permission. Doctor will look at me. I'm like, I'm not the one you're touching. Look at her. Don't ask me unless you're touching me. And that's consent, but people freak out and they hear consent. They assume sex. I'm like, okay. And then the watching porn thing, nobody is watching porn because they didn't get good anatomy lessons. They didn't get good anatomical sex education about like the difference between the vulva and the vagina and things like that. They're watching it because they're looking for the pleasure-based stuff. We don't teach it. We barely can get adults to get in a classroom or online to learn it. But there's nothing that you would have learned going through all your sex education of if, like, let's say that you live in the most progressive state you could, that they are on it with the sex education from the jump, and you have a very good idea of the anatomical physical body and human sexuality and gender studies, and you have all of this just good, healthy information. What the hell do you do to take all of that and make it tangible in the bedroom? We didn't give you any of that. We told you where the clit was, not how to use it. We told you what a vibrator was, but not why it works. And so there's this lack of, they know the information. They know what it is. They don't know what to do with it. And so they take the information they know and they go and they look at things like porn because they're looking for it to be applicable in their life. And if we actually taught sex education, just basic comprehensive sex education and pleasure-based sex education, or made it available to people, it would change people's lives. First of all, who is ever going to be like, I'm super good with my bad sex, thank you. It's going to help people that it's good to have anyway. This is perfecting an art. And if the more partners you bring on, the different partners, you are wiping that slate clean. You are going from square A with what that person likes. And if you had more pleasure-based sex education, you're not necessarily seeking it out to try to see what it is. It may be something that you do as a stimulant for whatever, for things like masturbation, that you're just using that as your visual stimulant. But no longer do you feel the need to reference pornography as your pleasure-based education, because you already have that information. You know what to do. This is now what you're doing with your partner. So this is every problem that arises with sex and kink can be fixed by education. Every single problem.
And people would be safer in theory.
And people
too.
would be safer. People would be safer and having better sex. There is no way this is not a win.
100%. That's all W's across the board. And a fabulous way to end the episode. Here's to good and safe sex, and hopefully in a lawful manner.
Yes.
Cheers.
Cheers. Thank you so much again for coming on, and remind us where people can find you.
You can find me on either TikTok or Instagram. It's Moxie Rose Dances, MOXIE. If you just search for Moxie Rose on Google, it'll bring up 1,000 different things related to me. If you are local to North Central Washington, I have a monthly column in the Comet magazine. And Mister Pierre Fashion out of Orlando is a fetish fashion company. I am their in-house sex educator and kink educator.
I can't wait to read your column.
Oh, every time that sometimes I get up on a soapbox about something, like when the Barbie movie came out, I did the history of Barbie, and that it actually, the image of Barbie as we know it came from a sex doll in Germany. So I did a whole deep dive into that. Yeah, that was fun.
Yeah.
I ruined that for a lot of people. It was exciting.
She's literally a modern day Carrie Bradshaw.
I
had so much fun. And it goes all the way back to the 1950s, when that was a sex doll from the 1950s. It was fantastic. So sometimes it's like that. Other times I'm just answering questions. I have an email that if anybody has any questions, it's dearmoxierose@gmail.com. And it's basically like a sex and kink version of Dear Abby.
I love it so much.
So cool. Well, hopefully we can have you back sometime. You're
absolutely anytime. I had a blast.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Well, we're going to hang out.
I appreciate it.
Yeah, you have a fabulous
Thank
evening.
you.
Thank you. You too.
Bye. So nice to meet you.
Nice to meet you.
That was so fun.
Yay.
She's so nice.
That was fun.
She's so nice.
I know.
How to go out. Wow.
Keep that in there.
I'm keeping that part in there too.
That should be the clip that you use for the advertising too. That we have a sexy episode and Kayla just doing bow chicka wow wow.
She's so cool. She
is so cool.
She has a burlesque group here in Wenatchee too. She leads a burlesque group. They perform.
Shut up.
That's
I want to
awesome.
go watch her do burlesque. That's awesome. Well, thank you so much for joining us and listening, Podcast Fam. I hope that you took something out of it. I know I did. It was kind of a different topic, and I think that it was hopefully an interesting one. I think I learned a lot. Yeah, I love that the law will take you through so many different topics and conversations. And again, that's kind of what we were wanting to do here, is just have different perspectives and just talk about all of the fun and interesting stuff with our job. I think sex cases are very interesting and very misunderstood across the board. Yeah, Kayla, again, good pick on the guest. It was very, very interesting.
Great job.
And thank you so much for joining us. With that note, cheers until next time, everybody.
Cheers.
Cheers.